You talk about Jesus, but you don't let him in. Yes, I am saying that the Christ you claim to follow may never have crossed the threshold of your inner kingdom, because it's much easier to admire a symbol from the outside than to allow it to break your masks, reveal your shadow, and change who you really are. And while you keep this Christ as an ornament, your cross remains leaning against the wall, and your fountain remains dry. Today, I'm going to expose what no one likes to admit. The Christ who transforms is not the one you applaud. It's the one you let confront you. If this already bothered you in the first few seconds, it's because you need to listen to the end. So subscribe to the channel now and activate the bell, because here we don't talk to massage your ego. Here we cross the desert, face the burning light, and carry the cross until the self truly awakens. There are those who hang verses on their walls, wear symbols around their necks, share beautiful phrases on social media, but live as if none of this has ever crossed their hearts. Carl Jung would say, this is like painting a rusty door gold and expecting it to become new on the inside. Spirituality, when it becomes a social facade, first deceives those who display it. It's easy to appear aligned with light and shadow when we're comfortable with a well-practiced discourse, but it's in the silent choices, those no one sees, that the self reveals whether this faith is alive or merely decorative. The problem is that the world applauds the display window and ignores the inventory. I know people who recite words about the inner realm, but live trapped in patterns that deny every syllable they utter. Wallpaper faith is clean, orderly, comfortable, and useless for crossing the desert. It doesn't withstand the first storm because it has no roots, only frames. It's like carrying a styrofoam cross. It seems heavy from afar, but melts at the first contact with rain. And when that happens, there's an embarrassing void left, because there's no real source to quench the thirst. Imagine someone who posts every day about gratitude, but deep down carries years of resentment. It's like smiling with your mouth while your eyes betray a shadow screaming inside. Carl Jung warned that the danger of superficial faith is that it becomes a shield to avoid confronting oneself. It's easier to flaunt symbols than to face the mirror. Simpler to sight the inner realm than to tear off one's own masks, except that this showcase spirituality works up to a point, and that point is always before the first real crisis. When the ground gives way, there's no point repeating mantras that never embodied the body. True faith isn't a performance, it's an internal structure that bears the weight of the cross when it's not a choice, but a necessity. It's what keeps the desert from becoming abandonment and transforms silence into a classroom, and if that sounds harsh, that's because it is. But sometimes the only way to replace wallpaper with foundation is to admit the house was never built. The difference between faith as decoration and faith as a foundation is felt, not displayed. The former seeks applause, the latter seeks coherence. A good way to understand which side we're on is to observe how we react away from the spotlight. In traffic, in an argument with a family member, in silent frustration, it's there that light and shadow meet and reveal whether there's truth or just pretty painting. If your spirituality can't handle the pressure of a difficult day, it's not spirituality, it's self-marketing. Want an exercise? For a week, exchange every sentence you'd post about faith for a concrete action. Visiting someone you've forgotten, forgiving without announcing it, donating without registering. In the end, realize how this affects the self more than any like. This uncomfortable exchange is what prepares you for the next step of the journey, learning to face silence without running away from it. Silence is one of the most dangerous environments for the ego, because there aren't enough distractions to keep the masks firmly in place. Carl Jung understood silence as a symbolic desert, a place where the self can finally hear itself, but where we're also forced to face the shadow unfiltered. This is why so many people run to noise, to notifications, to any conversation that keeps the mind occupied. Silence exposes. It shows what showcase spirituality doesn't support. In the desert of silence, the cross we carry becomes heavier because there's no audience to applaud us. And it's there that thirst reveals from which source we truly draw, external approval or the inner realm. It's not comfortable. On the contrary, silence is a magnified mirror of our contradictions. But fleeing from it is like refusing anesthesia before surgery. It seems to relieve the pain now, but it prolongs the pain that will inevitably come. The temptation to escape silence is ancient. Since biblical times, there have been stories of those who couldn't bear the weight in the desert and built idols to entertain themselves. Today, our idols are made of glass and LED, the screen that never goes off, the feed that never ends. But the effect is the same, postponing the encounter with the self. Jung would say that until we cross the inner desert, we will remain prisoners of external noise. And there's a difference between being alone and being silent. You can live alone and still be surrounded by other people's voices, podcasts, videos, messages, because emptiness is frightening. The wellspring that never runs dry is within, but it requires that we first empty the cup full of distractions, and that's not romantic. It's uncomfortable, sometimes painful. Silence has a cruel way of reminding us that much of what we call peace is merely the absence of conflict, not the presence of God. A simple practice for embracing silence is to begin with short, intentional, daily, noise-free breaks. It's not just about turning off your cell phone, it's also about turning off the compulsion to fill the space. Sit in a place where there are no stimuli and simply observe the sound of your breathing, the weight of your body, your mind trying to invent urgencies. This is how the desert begins to become known and little by little ceases to be a threat and becomes sacred territory. It is here that light and shadow meet without intermediaries, and the inner realm begins to manifest as a constant presence. When the inner source reveals itself, you realize that silence is not absence, but plenitude. And this discovery prepares you for the next inevitable obstacle, the cross we try to avoid, but which stands right in the middle of our path. You can even pretend it's not there, but the cross doesn't disappear just because you look away. Carl Jung would say that everything we avoid in the light returns in the shadows, and the cross is exactly that. The weight you don't want, but which shapes the self when accepted. The problem is that the ego hates inevitable pain. It prefers to negotiate, invent shortcuts, seek spiritual shortcuts that promise rebirth without death, victory without desert, light without shadow. But the inner realm doesn't open to those who avoid the crossing. The cross you reject is the same one that blocks the source from which the strength to live would come. It could be a loss you haven't processed, a forgiveness you've never attempted, a mistake you'd rather hide. Running away seems strategic, until you realize the weight only grows. And here's a shock. Often the paralyzing pain doesn't come from the cross, but from the futile effort of carrying it with one hand while the other tries to save face. When the cross arrives, and it always does, you have two choices: drag yourself along complaining or use it as leverage. There is no true spirituality that ignores this. Jesus crossed the desert with it, not to exempt us from the burden, but to show that the path involves accepting raw reality. Jung would see this as a universal symbol, the cross as an integration of opposites, light and shadow meeting at the point of greatest pain. Avoiding this encounter is condemning yourself to repeat the same falls. Want a practical example? Take something that is holding you back today, and instead of asking, "How can I get rid of this?" ask, "How can this transform me?" This simple change of question already opens space for the self to act. And make no mistake, it's not a matter of positive thinking, it's the discipline to remain in discomfort until it reveals the hidden lesson. Accepting the cross isn't about enjoying the pain. It's about understanding that running away from it costs more. Every time you refuse to cross, the path lengthens and the soul becomes exhausted. The cross is heavy, but it's not infinite. What makes it unbearable is the ego's resistance. And here's the bold point. Perhaps what you call a trial is just the delay you created yourself. The cross you face early becomes a story of overcoming. The cross you avoid becomes a lifelong prison. Carrying it head-on with steady hands is like digging the first well in the middle of the desert and discovering that the source was there all along, waiting for your courage. But this discovery brings another uncomfortable revelation. Not all the love you've experienced so far has been true, and that's precisely where the next chapter begins. Not every love that seems beautiful is true, and Carl Jung knew this. He warned that part of what we call love is actually a projection of our shadow. It's when the need to fill a void disguises itself as generosity, when neediness dresses up as romance. Spirituality, when distorted, can even encourage this game, confusing self-love with an inflated ego or emotional dependence with surrender. The self, however, is not fooled. It recognizes when we are trading affection in exchange for validation. It's easy to talk about love when everything is fine. It's difficult to keep the light on when the relationship becomes a mirror that exposes the shadow you never wanted to see. The inner realm does not flourish where there is manipulation, even if that manipulation is subtle. And if you want to know where the shadow of your love lies, observe where there is resentment, pressure, and fear. The love that arises from this is not free. It is a cross disguised as an embrace. The shadow of love doesn't just appear in romantic relationships. It's in the friendship that suffocates, the family that controls, the colleague who helps expecting something in return. It's love as condition, love as currency. Jung would say this is like drinking from a contaminated spring. It quenches your thirst for a moment, but gradually poisons you. The integration of light and shadow in love requires us to face our hidden expectations. How many times have you helped someone just to feel indispensable? How many times have you been hurt because the other person didn't reciprocate as you expected? This is love as a mask, not as its essence. A practical exercise. Choose a person with whom you feel recurring frustration and ask yourself, what do I really expect from them that I'm not saying? The answer may be uncomfortable, but it is liberating. It is in this confrontation that the self begins to heal the root of the relational shadow. The alchemy of forgiveness is the antidote to the shadow of love. Not the superficial forgiveness that's paid lip service, but the kind that dissolves the need to control the other. This forgiveness isn't a favor, it's liberation. By forgiving, you empty the emotional cross you carry and make room for the source to flow unhindered. But here's the hard part. Forgiving also means letting go of the version of love you've created to keep your ego comfortable. It's allowing the light to expose where you've used care to manipulate or surrender to nullify yourself. When this happens, the inner realm becomes a safe space for a more real love. A love that doesn't need guarantees to exist. And it's precisely when the light enters this realm that the next challenge arises, dealing with the discomfort of being exposed by it. Light isn't always comfortable. Sometimes it's a spotlight on your face when you're still trying to sleep. Carl Jung reminded us that bringing something from the shadows into consciousness can be as painful as it is liberating. True spirituality isn't just about moments of peace. It includes confrontations that destabilize the ego. When the light enters, it illuminates what you swore was hidden. Destructive patterns, convenient lies, crosses you pretended not to bear. And here comes the dilemma. It's easier to complain about the brightness than to face what it reveals. The inner realm is only built when we accept that part of the healing begins with this initial discomfort. The light reveals the dust we've swept under the rug, and as embarrassing as it may be, it's this dust that's preventing us from drinking from the source. To shy away from this exposure is to miss the chance for transformation. Being exposed by the light is like having a secret revealed by someone who doesn't want to destroy you, but to save you. It seems cruel at first, but it's pure mercy. Jung saw this process as essential to individuation. Without clearly seeing what sabotages us, there's no way to integrate the shadow. In practice, this can happen in an uncomfortable conversation, in unexpected feedback, or even in the mirror on any given day. The impact is the same. The ego feels threatened, the self sees an opportunity, and you have two options: deny and protect yourself, or take a deep breath and allow yourself to see everything. To avoid collapsing in the face of the revelation, it's necessary to create small, grounding rituals, write about what was exposed, seek a mentor or therapist to help interpret, practice moments of silence to let the insight settle. Thus, the light ceases to be an aggression and becomes an ally. Embracing uncomfortable truths is a daily act of courage. It's not enough to simply see, you have to live differently after the light shows you the way. This means changing habits, reviewing choices, asking for forgiveness, and rebuilding bridges. The inner kingdom doesn't grow with discourse about light and shadow. It grows when practice accompanies revelation. And here, I dare say, those who run away from the light that reveals themselves are condemned to repeat the same darkness until they learn. The good news is that the more you allow yourself to be seen, the lighter the cross becomes, and the freer the flow of the source within you. But in this process, there's a part many people forget. The light also reveals the child you've hidden deep within, and rediscovering it can be as transformative as it is painful. Within every adult is a child who once believed everything, until life taught them to distrust. Carl Jung saw this inner child as a living archetype, not a sentimental memory. It is the part of the self that holds spontaneous laughter, fearless creativity, and faith that needed no proof. But over time, we learn to clothe it with armor, social rules, unhealed traumas, emotional crosses that were not ours to bear. The inner realm weakens when this child is locked away, because it is the guardian of a source that never runs dry, that of authenticity. And here's the uncomfortable truth: hiding this child is also hiding the purest part of your spirituality. You can talk about light and shadow all you want, but if this child cannot play, create, and love without calculation, its light will always be filtered by fear. Hiding your inner child doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow, almost invisible process. It begins with small disappointments, continues with harsh criticism, and grows with unfair comparisons. Until one day, you realize that your natural curiosity has been replaced by a survival manual. Jung would say that's when the desert sets in. You continue living, but without the fresh water of this inner source. Spirituality loses color, relationships become mechanical, and the self adapts to a role it didn't write. Recovering this child requires courage to open rusted doors, revisit memories, and yes, forgive those who helped bury it. A simple exercise? Look at photos of yourself as a child and write a letter to this version, telling it exactly what it needs to hear. It seems silly, but this gesture creates a direct channel between the present-day you and your essence. When the inner child breathes again, something changes in the way you face the cross and the desert. Suddenly, life isn't just about carrying weight, but also about finding small places of rest along the way. The inner realm expands because the light that was once filtered by distrust now passes through cleanly, illuminating the shadows without fear. This child doesn't eliminate challenges, but restores the freshness of those who can still be surprised. And there's a detail few realize. Integrating this child also means freeing yourself from the need to constantly prove yourself. It's living spirituality as a living experience, not an obligation. But not everyone is ready for this, and many only manage to take this step when they learn the forgiveness they've never truly tried. You may have forgiven many people, at least in your mind. But Carl Jung reminded us that forgiveness isn't an intellectual decision, it's a transformation of the self. The forgiveness you claim to have given, but which still hurts when the subject comes up again, isn't forgiveness. It's just an agreement not to touch the wound. True spirituality demands a more radical forgiveness, one that dissolves resentment without requiring the other person to change. It's like letting go of a cross you've carried for years, but no longer remember why you picked it up. The inner realm doesn't flourish where hurt takes deep root. And here's the hard part. Sometimes the forgiveness you need most isn't for the other person, but for yourself. Forgiving your own shadow, your own choices, the lost time is freeing the source that was dammed up. This is the forgiveness you've never attempted because it requires facing truths you'd rather bury. Truly forgiving doesn't mean forgetting or accepting injustice. It means letting go of the rope that binds you to the past. Jung saw this as an act of individuation. The moment when the self stops wasting energy holding on to old pain and begins investing in building the inner kingdom. Deep forgiveness starts small. It might mean writing a letter that will never be sent just to give form to what has been trapped. It might mean choosing not to entertain thoughts of revenge when they arise. It might mean praying for the well-being of the one who hurt you, even if your ego screams in rage. These actions are like opening cracks in the dam until the spring water flows again. And here's a warning. This process may be uncomfortable, even unfair in the eyes of the world, but in the eyes of the soul, it is pure liberation. The forgiveness you've never attempted is also what can change the way you carry your cross. Suddenly, it remains heavy, but it doesn't hurt as much as before. Hurt is corrosive. It weakens the hands that hold the weight and clouds your vision of the path. When you release this burden, the desert stops feeling like punishment and starts to feel like an opportunity for rebirth. And there's a powerful side effect. Compassion grows. You begin to realize that everyone on some level is trying to deal with their own shadow. This kind of forgiveness doesn't depend on the other person. It depends only on your courage. And it's this courage that opens the door to a state of consciousness where the inner realm ceases to be theory and becomes the place you live from every day. The kingdom is not an address on a map. Carl Jung would say it is an internal dimension where the self is aligned and light and shadow coexist without war. Jesus said, "The kingdom of God is within you." And this destroys the idea that we need to achieve something external to feel complete. The problem is that the ego prefers to believe otherwise because it can justify the eternal race for new achievements. When the kingdom is understood as a state of consciousness, spirituality ceases to be an escape and becomes presence. You don't need to wait for life to get perfect to access it. You just need to decide to stop negotiating with your own soul. This state begins to manifest when, even in the desert, you feel the source flowing within. It's not an instant miracle. It's a process of integration that dispenses applause and external validation. Living in the kingdom as a state of consciousness means realizing that everything, absolutely everything, can be a spiritual practice. Washing the dishes, talking to a stranger, navigating a conflict. Jung would see this as the maturity of the self, which doesn't need a sacred setting to act. The inner kingdom is active when you respond with presence rather than with automatic reaction, when you choose not to feed the shadow, even though you have every reason to. A simple exercise. Choose one day of the week to act as if every small gesture were part of a ritual. This changes the way you walk, speak, and breathe. Little by little, the cross ceases to be an obstacle and becomes an altar. The desert ceases to be an exile and becomes a retreat. The spring ceases to be sought and begins to flow from where you are. This state of consciousness isn't unshakable. It needs to be cultivated. All it takes is one slip, one distraction for the ego to regain control and push you back into the old race. That's why constant practice is essential. Meditation, prayer, reading texts that elevate your vision, all of these keep the kingdom alive. But above any practice is the daily decision to live in alignment, even when it's easier to give in to autopilot. The greatest proof that you're in this state isn't the absence of problems, but the presence of peace amidst them. And when this peace is established, you naturally become a channel so that the source never runs dry. The spring that never runs dry is not a distant promise. It is an internal reality for those who live connected to the self. Carl Jung would say that this spring is the natural flow of life that emerges when light and shadow are integrated, when the inner realm is more than mere talk. But the ego, accustomed to control, fears this flow. It prefers to store, retain, and keep to itself. But spirituality doesn't work that way. The more you try to hold back, the more the river dries up. This spring is abundance that doesn't depend on external circumstances, not subject to emotional or financial climate. It's like a well in the middle of the desert. You know it's there, but you need to have the courage to dig. And digging, in this case, is trusting, even when the evidence says otherwise. It's choosing to believe that if you stay present and open, the water will spring forth. The flow of the source is maintained when you position yourself as a channel, not a reservoir. The reservoir accumulates, fears loss, measures how much it offers. The channel lets go, trusting that more will always come. Jung would see this as the victory of the self over the ego. In practice, this means generosity as a posture, not an occasional event. It's not giving only when there's surplus, but allowing the cross of relinquishing control to shape you. It could mean giving time to those in need, listening without rushing, sharing knowledge without fear of losing space. This posture opens a constant path for the source to flow because it only stays alive in movement. In the desert, stagnant water evaporates. Flowing water is renewed. This is the spiritual logic that keeps you nourished even when the world seems dry. To activate this source, you need to break down internal dams: fear, resentment, attachment. These are what interrupt the flow and transform the inner realm into a stagnant reservoir. A practical exercise: identify an area of your life where you feel scarcity and give something related to it. If it's a lack of money, donate a small amount. If it's loneliness, offer companionship. If it's time, invest some of it in someone. This act signals to the self that you trust in abundance. And as this trust grows, the source begins to manifest in unexpected ways: connections, opportunities, solutions. But this experience also brings a deeper invitation to listen to the inner Christ that you often keep outside. The inner Christ is not a distant figure from 2,000 years ago. He's a living archetype within yourself, waiting to be recognized. Carl Jung saw this figure as the ultimate expression of the integration of light and shadow, the point at which the human and the divine embrace within us. But the ego prefers to keep this Christ outside, as if it were safer to admire him than to imitate him. Admiration does not require change. Incarnation requires dying to what is false. This is why so many people talk about the inner realm without ever having set foot in it. Recognizing the inner Christ is accepting the cross, crossing the desert, drinking from the source and living coherently. It is allowing him to confront your habits, your narratives, and your masks. This is not about religion, but about living spirituality, the kind that disarms the ego and exposes what truly governs your life when no one is looking. Following a symbol is easy. Embodying a symbol is a revolution. The inner Christ asks you not only to believe in him, but to live as he lived, present, compassionate, courageous. Jung would say that this is the journey of individuation elevated to the sacred. It is the moment when the self ceases to be a concept and becomes practice, when light illuminates even the darkest corners and the shadow becomes fuel for compassion. This can begin with small gestures, responding patiently to a provocation, offering forgiveness where the ego demands revenge, serving without expecting recognition. These silent acts are what shape your psyche to receive and manifest this presence. And as you repeat them, you realize that the inner Christ is not a visitor. He is the host of the inner realm, and he has been waiting for you to open the door. Hearing the Christ within above the noise requires practice. The world speaks loudly, opinions, demands, comparisons. His voice, however, is like that of a spring in the middle of the desert, constant yet gentle. To hear it, you need to silence internal distractions, old narratives, and the fear of change. A simple exercise is to set aside time each day to ask yourself, if I acted from myself, guided by this presence, what would I do now? And then, act. Don't wait until you feel ready, but act. It is in this movement that consciousness expands and the inner realm ceases to be a promise and becomes a lived territory. Recognizing and following the Christ within doesn't guarantee a life without crosses, but it does ensure that each cross you carry becomes a bridge to something greater. And if you've come this far, you already know that this journey doesn't end. It deepens with each step. He arrives. You already know where the door is, and you know it doesn't open by itself. The inner Christ that you keep outside will not break into anything. He waits for you to have the courage to turn the key, and every day you put it off, the cross gets heavier, the desert drier, and the spring further away. It's not because God has walked away, it's because you've decided to bargain with your own soul. So I ask you, what is the shadow that you are protecting to the point of blocking the light? What cross are you willing to bear now, not tomorrow? Reply here in the comments and don't come at me with pretty phrases. Tell me the truth, even if it hurts, because maybe your comment will be the push someone else needs to get out of their paralysis. And if you don't want to live another year pretending you don't know, subscribe to the channel now, activate the bell, and stay with me. Because the next video will rip off more masks than you can imagine.